Brazil. In the 19th century, a boy with dark skin was sold into slavery by his own white father. 30 years later, he stood in court, armed not with chains but with words. His name was Luis Gama, the lawyer who freed his own people. He was born between two worlds, one of privilege and one of chains. Luis Gonzaga Pinto da Gama entered the world in 1830 in the bustling port city of Salvador, Bahia, where the air smelled of salt and sugar, and where freedom and slavery walked the same streets. His mother, Luisa Mahin, was a free black woman of African descent, a revolutionary mind, known for helping organize slave uprisings and for carrying messages written in Yoruba through the night. His father was a white man of the minor nobility, a gambler, a man of words, but not of honor. When Luis was 10, the boy who bore both their bloods became his father's debt. One night, his father called him into a carriage under the pretext of travel. They rode for hours until the boy's eyes grew heavy. When he woke, he was in the slave market of São Paulo, tagged, priced, and sold. That was how his life split open. The bright, curious child from Bahia became a servant nameless in a city of light and cruelty. He learned to read faces before he learned to read words. He learned when to bow his head and when to stay silent. But deep inside, the voice of his mother, the revolutionary, still whispered. It said that no chain is eternal. At night, when the house slept, Luis would pick up scraps of paper discarded by his master's sons. He traced letters, copied shapes, and listened at doors when lessons were taught. Word by word, letter by letter, he rebuilt what had been stolen from him knowledge. Years later, he wrote, "I do not know who taught me freedom. Perhaps it was pain. Pain became his first teacher. Memory, his only friend. And from those ashes, a man began to rise. One who would one day wield not a whip, but the law itself." São Paulo, in the mid-1800s, was a city that prided itself on being civilized. Its theaters glowed, its universities thrived, and its elites dined under chandeliers made from imported glass. Yet in the alleys behind their mansions, black men and women carried water, polished shoes, and lived without names. Luis was one of them. He was assigned household work, serving at tables, cleaning, running errands. He was the invisible boy in rooms of marble and gold. But while others saw him as background, he was studying every voice, every law, every insult. He learned that power had its own language, so he began to learn it too. He mimicked the master's Portuguese, sharpened his pronunciation, and stored every word like a weapon. His mind became a silent rebellion. When guests at the dinner table mocked the idea that a black man could think, he memorized their laughter. Years later, he would answer it in ink. He became known among servants as the boy who remembered everything. When others cried, he promised them quietly that he would never forget that one day he would speak for them. Outside, Brazil's empire flourished on sugar and coffee. Ships came and went, loaded with lives. The city sparkled, but its light was stolen from the backs of men like Luis. And still, he waited, observing, listening, becoming. The chains around his wrists would rust before his will did. Because even in bondage, Luis Gama was already learning the first rule of revolution, that freedom begins in the mind. By the time Luis reached 18, he had lived more than half his life in bondage, but he had never accepted the title of slave. He had read enough, observed enough, and remembered enough to begin questioning everything. One evening, while delivering a message for his master, he overheard two lawyers discussing a law from 1831. The one declaring that all Africans illegally imported into Brazil after that year were to be considered free. The words struck him like thunder. His mother, Luisa Mahin, had been a free woman. That meant he could never have been legally enslaved. The realization ignited a storm inside him. For years, Luis had lived under the illusion that he was property, but now, the law itself whispered otherwise. That night, under a dim street lamp, he made a vow. He would escape. The opportunity came soon. His master, confident of his obedience, sent him on an errand to the outskirts of the city. Luis did not return. He walked for days, barefoot, sleeping in fields, hiding from patrols. Every step away from São Paulo was a step toward his own humanity. When he finally reached the coast, he had nothing but a name and a mind full of words. He sold small poems to travelers, wrote letters for the illiterate, and earned coins where he could. For the first time in his life, he ate not because someone ordered him to, but because he had earned it. Yet freedom was not simple. Poverty followed him like a shadow. People refused to hire a black man who could read, but Luis never looked back. He understood that liberty was not a destination, it was a daily fight. And somewhere inside, he began to dream not only of saving himself, but of returning to save others. He once wrote in a private letter, "If my skin condemns me, then let my mind be my defense." He had escaped slavery, but the real war, the war of ideas, was only beginning. In the years that followed, Luis Gama discovered the power of the written word. He began writing poetry at first, verses about longing and exile, then about injustice and rage. His poems circulated in cafes, among students and journalists, until they reached the hands of editors. Soon, he found his voice in the press. Under the pseudonym Getulino, he began publishing satirical pieces that exposed the hypocrisy of Brazil's slave-owning elite. He compared the masters to beasts who wear human masks, and mocked judges who twisted the law to keep men in chains. His words were sharp, dangerous, and alive. For the first time, a black man in Brazil spoke not from chains, but from the printed page, and the empire heard him. But Luis did not stop at writing. The law fascinated him. He spent nights in the library of São Paulo's law school, reading every statute, every decree, every record he could find. He memorized court procedures, studied Latin phrases, and copied the arguments of famous jurists until he could think like them. He was a man without a diploma, but with the mind of a lawyer. When others shouted for revolution with swords, Luis chose another weapon, the pen. He said, "If they will not listen to our pain, they will read it." His articles became a quiet rebellion, spreading from one newspaper to another. And within those lines, he planted an idea that terrified the empire more than any uprising could, that justice, when spoken aloud, could make the law tremble. By the 1860 seconds, Luis Gama had become a figure both admired and feared in São Paulo. He wore no robe of office, carried no formal degree, yet his presence in court was enough to unnerve even the most experienced magistrates. He knew the law sometimes better than those paid to enforce it. He found his opening in the law of 1831, that fragile clause declaring all Africans imported after that date to be free. For decades, the empire had ignored it, calling it a dead letter. Luis decided to bring it back to life. He began to represent enslaved people who came to him in secret. Some arrived at his door in the middle of the night, trembling, clutching papers or baptism records. Others brought nothing but hope. Luis listened to each story with the patience of a priest and the precision of a strategist. In court, he argued with fire, citing the emperor's own decrees, turning their polished Latin phrases into weapons of truth. His cases were relentless. If one judge dismissed him, he appealed to another. If a verdict went against him, he took it to the next court. Piece by piece, case by case, he forced the legal system to look at itself. The newspapers began to notice. Some praised him as the people's advocate. Others mocked him as the black troublemaker who twists the law. But it was undeniable, Luis Gama was freeing people. Witnesses described him standing in court, thin and serious, his eyes unwavering as he spoke for those who could not. No one could silence him, because he used the very words of the law they worshipped. Within a few years, he had personally secured the freedom of hundreds. Each case was a battle, but each victory was a crack in the wall of slavery. And when critics sneered that he had no diploma, he replied simply, "My degree was written in the scars of my people." The courtroom had become his battlefield, and every verdict was a revolution in miniature. The elite could no longer pretend not to hear him. Planters and judges whispered his name with bitterness. To them, Luis was a threat, not because he broke the law, but because he obeyed it too perfectly. He forced them to face their contradictions. When they said, "The law does not apply to people like you," he answered, "Then it is not law." When they accused him of blasphemy against the empire, he said, "It is not blasphemy to speak truth in the house of lies." He reminded them that justice could not be selective, that a nation built on chains could never call itself civilized. In hearing after hearing, Luis exposed the hypocrisy of men who quoted philosophy, but profited from suffering. He made them sign the papers that freed their own captives. More than once, Magistrates trembled as they wrote their signatures, knowing that each stroke of the pen was a blow against the system that fed them. One contemporary wrote, "He spoke with the calm of a scholar and the fury of a prophet." The empire began to fear not riots, but reason. Outside the courts, freed men and women began to gather near his home to thank him. Some left fruit, others flowers, others just prayers whispered in the night. Luis never took money for his work. His reward, he said, was seeing another human being walk out the door unchained. For the first time in Brazilian history, a man of African descent had made the law itself tremble, not by breaking it, but by using it as a mirror. Luis Gama proved something dangerous, that true justice doesn't need permission, it only needs courage. Luis Gama never raised a fist, yet every word he spoke struck like a hammer. He had discovered the one weapon the empire could not confiscate: intelligence. And with it, he waged a war of quiet defiance. He faced humiliation daily. Judges refused to shake his hand. Newspapers insulted his color, calling him the black demagogue with ink-stained fingers. Still, he wrote. Still, he spoke. Still, he freed. When one plantation owner told him, "You're just a black man who learned to scribble," Luis smiled calmly and answered, "Then this black man will write the freedom of those you call property." He did. He filed petitions for women separated from their children, for men imprisoned beyond sentence, for youths born free but sold as slaves. And when he won, he didn't celebrate. He simply moved to the next case. He lived modestly, often surviving on the charity of friends. His clothes were worn, his shoes patched, but his voice carried weight across São Paulo. Students at the law school began visiting him for advice. Some professors invited him secretly to speak. His arguments, fierce, logical, poetic, began to influence the next generation of lawyers. To the elite, he was dangerous because he had become uncontainable. They could not silence him with threats because he owned nothing they could take. They could not disgrace him because he already lived with dignity beyond their reach. Luis's revenge was not fire or blood. It was education. It was forcing the men of power to confront an idea older and stronger than their empire: that knowledge, once awakened, cannot be enslaved. He often said, "They can steal our labor, but not our mind. They can chain our bodies, but not our memory." Through his words, he gave others the same weapon, the courage to think. And in the silence of night, he wrote letters for those who could not write their names, transforming pain into literacy, and literacy into liberation. Luis Gama's revolution was invisible, but it was everywhere. By 1882, Brazil was trembling on the edge of change. The abolitionist movement had gained voices, protests were spreading, and newspapers debated freedom as if it were an approaching storm. Yet the man who had sparked much of that fire, Luis Gama, was fading. Years of exhaustion had weakened him. He had spent decades fighting the empire's cruelty with pen and reason, and now his body was surrendering. Still, he refused to rest. Even in illness, he dictated petitions from his bed, freeing people until his final days. On the 24th of August 1882, at the age of 52, he drew his last breath. He never saw the final victory, the abolition of slavery in 1888, but he had laid its foundation in silence and ink. When news of his death spread, something extraordinary happened. Hundreds of freed men and women, those whose names he had once written into the court ledgers of freedom, filled the streets of São Paulo. They carried flowers, candles, and songs. Some walked barefoot, others wore their only good clothes. None of them were rich. At his funeral, the crowd was so large that carriages could not pass. People stood on rooftops, weeping. The city that had once sold him as a child now mourned him as a hero. No marble grave marked his rest. Instead, someone wrote in charcoal on the cemetery wall, "Luis Gama, born in chains, died free." That simple phrase became a nation's epitaph for its conscience. He had not lived to see the empire admit defeat, but every signature he forced from a trembling judge, every mind he awakened, had pushed Brazil one step closer to freedom. Luis Gama died without wealth, without rank, but not without victory. He had proven that even in the darkest empire, a single man armed with truth could bend history. And when his voice fell silent, the silence itself began to speak. More than a century passed before Brazil finally began to understand who Luis Gama truly was. For decades after his death, textbooks ignored him. Statues were built for generals and emperors, not for the black man who had fought them with words. His name vanished from public memory, just as he had once been erased from the law. But history has a way of remembering what nations try to forget. In the late 20th century, scholars rediscovered his writings, his petitions, and his poetry. They read his satire, his letters, his legal arguments, and realized that Gama had not only defended justice, he had redefined it. His words had planted the moral logic that would eventually make slavery impossible to justify. Then, in 2015, the Brazilian Bar Association issued a historic declaration. They awarded Luis Gama the title of Doctor of Law posthumously, recognizing him as one of the greatest jurists in the country's history. The ceremony was solemn, not merely an honor, but an apology. The same institution that once denied him the right to study law now bowed before his legacy. Across Brazil, schools began teaching his story. His face appeared in murals, his name in textbooks, his quotations in classrooms. A major avenue in São Paulo, Avenida Luis Gama, now carries his memory through the city that once enslaved him. Young lawyers visit his resting place and leave their graduation rings beside his grave. Activists quote him in protests. For them, Luis Gama is not a relic. He is a voice that still warns the powerful. Justice without equality is merely another form of tyranny. His legacy lives in every courtroom that dares to listen to the truth over privilege, in every student who opens a book believing that words can change the world. Luis Gama never wore chains again, and he made sure that others wouldn't either. He proved that freedom is not granted by kings or decrees. It is earned by those who dare to understand it. Through knowledge, he made himself immortal. Luis Gama's life is a story of impossible transformation, from a child sold by his own father to a man who used the empire's laws to dismantle the empire's cruelty. He never commanded armies. He never spilled blood. His rebellion was built from paper, ink, and conviction. Yet his victories were as real as any won on the battlefield. In a world where color decided destiny, Gama proved that the mind has no master. He believed that true freedom could never come from violence alone. It must come from justice, from reasoning so powerful, so undeniable, that even tyrants are forced to listen. Every document he filed, every argument he made, was an act of faith. Faith that humanity could be educated out of its cruelty. He understood something profound, that knowledge, once born, can spread faster than any army. He left behind no riches, no mansion, no dynasty, only words. But those words have outlived kings and governments. They still whisper through the halls of Brazil's courthouses. If justice has a color, it must be the color of humanity. That line, simple, devastating, defines his entire life. Luis Gama's story reminds us that freedom is not a moment. It is a discipline. It must be practiced every day, in thought, in courage, in compassion. He was born between two worlds, one of privilege and one of chains, and he chose neither. He built a third world instead, one where dignity belonged to all. And long after his voice was silenced, the sound of his truth still echoes, teaching us that the greatest revolutions are not written in blood, but in justice.